Then Herod dies, and if it feels like I haven't mentioned Luke for a while, it's because none of this happens in Luke's telling of the story. Luke and Matthew both provide a different father for Joseph. Luke gives his father as Heli, Matthew gives his father as Jacob. John says that Jesus refused to be held or touched. And in Luke, the risen Jesus invites his followers to touch him to prove that he's not a ghost. Come on, bro, touch me. See? Real as dude. Hello lovely people, my name is Emma. Welcome back to my channel, and welcome if you are new. Bible is true. Some say yes. All. What a stupid intro. Let's just kick off with a disclaimer, shall we? Some people are going to see the title topic and see this as an attack on Christianity, or on Judaism when we talk about the Hebrew Bible, what Christians refer to as the Old Testament. I want to make it very clear that this is not the case. Pointing out internal inconsistencies in the Bible is a challenge to literalism, so if you are a biblical literalist, I encourage you to watch this video. Do your own research. Dive a bit deeper into the topic, hopefully maybe reconsider that position. Nothing about these internal inconsistencies is a particular challenge to faith unless your faith is based in biblical literalism, and that's not what I intend to do here. Indeed, by and large, the studies of Bible texts that give us this information come from great Christian scholars. Most people study the Bible as a means to better understand and form a closer relationship with God. So, does the Bible contain internal contradictions with itself? Yes, it does. Why does it matter? It doesn't really, unless you're a biblical literalist, and it's usually in response to those people that I would point out these inconsistencies. I do also think that this is a really beneficial exercise in general if you want to debate, understand the Bible better, if you are interested from a skeptic's or a believer's perspective. Appreciating and understanding the Bible as a collection of texts, as an anthology, is just so important in getting to the heart of what the actual message of each book is. If we try and take the entire Bible as a single cogent story, we run into serious problems trying to understand the author's intentions. So taking these all as separate books with separate meanings is crucial to understanding the intentions of the author. If that's important to you for either reasons spiritual, cultural, or just out of academic interest, a great place to start is with finding and acknowledging the differences between these stories. I decided to make this video after a comment asking if I would talk about the historical, scientific, or intertextual contradictions in the Bible. Like I said, I think this is the best place to start. Before we even take the Bible into its cultural context, let's just look at it text by text and see what's going on within the book before we start to branch out. This is also the easiest one to experience for yourself. If you do not want to trust an agnostic atheist on the internet, I completely understand. You can do this yourself very easily. All you need is a pencil, a piece of paper, and a Bible. Usual disclaimer, I use the English Standard Version. If you're inclined to click away because it's not the New King James Version, then you probably wouldn't have listened to anything else in this video anyway, so that's okay. For the purposes of what we're doing here, it really doesn't matter which version of the Bible you're using. If you decide to dive deeper into more sort of contradictions between stories and the way things are written, then it can benefit you to look up certain different translations. For today, whatever version you have is fine. Or if you just want to listen to my video, you don't need any Bible. Strap in, get a hot drink, and prepare for some intertextual analysis. I know how to make videos entertaining. Let's start at the beginning, figuratively and literally, if we're looking at the Bible. One of the best known contradictions in the Hebrew Bible is between Genesis chapters 1 and 2, probably because it is literally at the very beginning, so more people have read it. Now, Genesis 1 and 2 are notably different both in terms of the order of creation and the described events, but also the literary style and the kind of format. I don't know why I'm doing this. Genesis 1 is more direct and organised. Genesis 2 is a bit more lyrical, shall we say. At the capital B beginning, God created man and animal. But in what order? In Genesis 1, he created all the animals and then man to have dominion over them. In Genesis 2, God created Adam and then thought, damn, he looks kinda lonely. And then created all the animals and let Adam name them. Cute. Genesis chapter 1 verse 25, and God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. Genesis chapter 2 verse 18. Then the Lord God said, it is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him. Now out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every bird of the heavens, and brought them to man to see what he would call them. This is probably the most referenced contradiction in the Hebrew Bible because A, as I said, it's literally at the very beginning, and B, it's a very straightforward contradiction. Genesis chapter 1 says something different about the order of creation to Genesis chapter 2. There's no complex explanation, it's simply two different tellings of the same story. The two texts cannot both be literal historical fact because they are at odds with each other. Additionally, Genesis 1 refers to God as Elohim, and Genesis 2 refers to God as Yahweh Elohim. For these reasons, as well as the stylistic and structural differences in the text, it's widely believed that there are two different authors in Genesis. The religious tradition, of course, is that this was all written by Moses. Let's talk about David's census. The moral of the story is humility to the Lord. David sinned by counting his military instead of trusting God. So who commanded such a sinful thing as counting his military? Well, according to 2 Samuel, God did. 2 Samuel chapter 24. Again the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, "Go number Israel and Judah." So the king said to Joab, the commander of the army who was with him, "Go through all the tribes of Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, and number the people, that I may know the number of the people." Pretty clear. God spoke to David, said, "Go do it," and David went and did it. This is a little confusing. God was essentially so pissed off that he incited the sin himself, which, if you were inclined to have the theological debate, could imply a contradiction with James 1:13, as well as several other places. God cannot be tempted to sin. I'll leave that with you to think about. So God incited David to take the census. Little bit confusing, not to worry, 1 Chronicles fixed the whole thing up. 1 Chronicles chapter 21, verse 1. Then Satan stood against Israel and incited David to number Israel. That's it. It's another pretty clear-cut contradiction in my opinion. One can, and apologists do, come up with ways to mitigate this contradiction. The main claim being that God incited the event by inciting Satan to incite David to sin. God can't commit sin, but he orchestrates everything. Therefore, he is ultimately responsible for Satan inciting David to sin, as a part of God's plan. However, a solo reading of 2 Samuel makes it pretty clear that Satan isn't considered to be involved. He's not mentioned even remotely. There's no hint of Satan about it. This is why, again, it's so important to remember that these are different books by different authors. One of my least favourite things about how the Bible is taught in a casual or sometimes church setting is this combining the different parts of the story to form one incoherent whole. You're an incoherent whole. I've read enough YouTube comments to know what's coming. You see this a lot with the Gospels, which I will talk about in a little bit. Jesus didn't say one thing in one book and one thing in another. He said all of the things, and different authors just picked it. That's a ludicrous way of reading these ancient texts. It does not do any justice to the authors. And it makes for unnecessarily confusing and contradictory storytelling. Here, 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles simply make different statements about what happened to make a different theological point. 2 Samuel says that God's fury prompted him to incite David to take the census. 1 Chronicles says that David was incited by Satan to sin against God. They're making different theological points, and we will never understand them properly if we try to change and twist one to fit the other. Let's take a quick look at our favourite Hebrew Bible narrative, the Great Flood. Bible quiz! How many of each species was Noah instructed to bring on the ark? The animals came on 2 by 2, hurrah, hurrah! But how many twos? According to Genesis chapter 6, it was 2 of every kind. Simple enough. I have no idea what this is or why I did that. Strangely though, God repeats this command a chapter later. Genesis chapter 7 verses 2 and 3. Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and his mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean, the male and his mate. 7 pairs of the birds of the heavens also, male and female, to keep their offspring alive on the face of the earth. The apologist argument here is one that slightly makes me chuckle, to be honest. The apologist argument is simply that God supplemented his original instruction. But it strikes me personally as a little odd that the all-knowing God wouldn't just make his instructions clear in the first instance. But hey, I'm not your mum. You can come to your own conclusions. I'm not your mum, I'm your grandma. On another personal note, one thing that has always slightly confounded me about the Hebrew Bible is this attempt to reconcile the character of God as one consistent entity. God is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving, and unchanging through each text in the Bible canon. And yet, in Ezekiel chapter 18 verse 20, we're told that the son should not bear the iniquities of the father. The soul who sins shall die. The son shall not suffer for the iniquity of the father, nor the father suffer for the iniquity of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself. Seems nice, seems fair, that's a moral I 100% get behind. But if we travel back to Exodus for a moment, you'll probably be familiar with this section as the 10 Commandments in Exodus. Chapter 20, verse 5, this is God telling you not to make graven images. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the 3rd and 4th generations of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands who love me, blah, blah, blah. That is God in one book of the Bible very specifically saying, if you do this thing, I will visit the iniquity of the gentleman who does it on his children for several generations. And a chapter in another book of the Bible that says, the children shall not bear the iniquity of the father. It's a straight up contradiction, yo! It's hard to argue that this isn't a direct contradiction when presented in contrast like this. The only apologetic argument I've seen for this particular one is the suggestion that the passage in Exodus actually means that the children will be predisposed to committing the same sins as the father. Except that's not what it says. If you take Exodus as an individual story, that is a leap beyond my logical understanding. A reading of the text makes very clear that if you do this thing, it will not just be you who is punished, it will be your children. That is part of the punishment, that is part of the threat, that is how severe this sin is. That's the point that Exodus is making. That's a very important theological point to wash away to make it fit with Ezekiel. Wait a second. The animals march in 2 by 2? I need to look this up. Ah, shit, yeah, they marched in. Well, no one's going to take me seriously now. Let's take a break for a moment and relax our pencils while I share with you a Bible-related news story that I found kind of funny. Funny in both a ha-ha and a kind of way. Republican State Superintendent Ryan Walters of Oklahoma has ordered that all public schools in Oklahoma must have Bibles in classrooms, and it seems like he's steering the purchases towards Trump-endorsed Bibles. Please, I have barely recovered from learning about the latest Trump-endorsed cryptocurrency. I cannot cope. That man will slap his family name on literally anything to make a buck. I heard about this story on Ground News, the sponsor of today's video and my go-to source for all the latest developments. As one might expect, the majority of the reporting on this story comes from the left and the centre, with right-leaning sources being scarce. Possibly Republican backing sources wanted to stay quiet on anything potentially controversial involving Trump in the run-up to the election. Using Ground News, we can pick a centre-leaning source with a high factuality rating like News Facts Network. Walter's request for proposal specifies that Bibles must be leather-bound, contain US foundational documents, and use the New King James Version, making most Bibles ineligible. Colleen McCarthy, Executive Director of the Oklahoma Appleseed Center for Law and Justice, noted that few Bibles meet the requirements. The main options are Trump-endorsed versions like the We the People Bible and God Bless the USA Bible. I'm sorry to say, the rest of the world does cringe. Those Bibles are priced between $60 and $90. Hefty! For balance, if we take a look at Oklahoman, a right-leaning source with a high factuality rating, we get more details on the financial side. If the Bibles cost $60 each, and the state buys $55,000, that's $3.3 million. They also point out that softback versions of the Bible can be bought at a tiny fraction of the price, again making me very suspicious about the fact that these Bibles supposedly need to be leather-bound, or bound in something leather-like. This article also quotes Walters on his specifications, which makes me highly suspicious again, given what we're doing here today. Listen to this. We don't want extra things in there. Historical documents are fine, Walters said. If it's the King James Version and the Constitution, the Magna Carta, things like that are also in statute that can be used in the classroom, that's fine. But we don't want commentary around the Bible, because this is to serve as a historical reference document. Heaven forfend, if you'll pardon the pun, that the very young people having this Bible forced upon them should also be allowed to learn the historical context, changes and additions made by later scribes, even contradictions in the text. This is a super interesting story to look at the bias for, because while a very small number of right-leaning papers have actually reported on the story, those that have focused on the financial details, the money that Trump himself stands to make and the potential conflict of interest there. The left-leaning articles have been more likely to highlight things like the separation of church and state and the ethics of forcing Bibles into classrooms in the first place. This is one of the reasons I love Ground News. It makes it so easy to get a really quick and simple overview of how different sides of the political spectrum respond to different news stories. The story we just looked at had a clear blind spot. If you were only reading right-leaning sources, you would have missed that entirely. On Ground News, there's an entire feed dedicated to stories like this that you might have missed, called the blind spot feed. I particularly enjoy this feature because it shows me what people in different political bubbles might be consuming that I might have otherwise missed out on. Being able to see all these articles and sources gathered from around the world in one place is one of the reasons I can't recommend Ground News enough. It's organised so we can see any biases, how reliable a source is, and who owns it. It makes spotting any slants or narratives in the news so much easier. That lets us read more critically and get a more balanced view of what's really going on. Right now they're having their biggest sale of the year. If you sign up through my link, grand.news/Emma Thorne, you get 50% off the Vantage subscription. That gives you unlimited access to all features. It's the same plan that I use every day. It's brilliant for getting access to the full picture on every story. I think you'll find it as invaluable as I do for getting through the spin and understanding what's really happening in the world. Do consider checking out the link down below. Now pick up your pencils. We're back to work. Here's a phrase you might be familiar with. No man is without sin. Excluding Jesus, the generally accepted tradition is that all men sin. In this case, men meaning mankind, thus including silly little guys. Ecclesiastes chapter 7 verse 20. Surely there is not a righteous man on earth who does good and never sins. Similarly, Romans chapter 3 verse 23. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. That's a big part of the story for a lot of people. We are all sinners, we have all sinned, therefore we all require salvation by Jesus and his forgiveness. That seems fine, but for a point we might recall from Genesis chapter 6, verse 9, these are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. That is why Noah alone, plus his family, was chosen by God to be the lone survivor in his great upending of the world he made. Then let's consider for a moment poor old Job, caught in the crossfire of a battle between God and Satan. Chapter 1, verse 1. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. The entire point of the story is that Satan tries to turn a blameless, righteous man away from God. Well, perhaps blameless doesn't really mean without sin, some argue. Unfortunately, that does not save us from this particular contradiction. 1 John chapter 5, verse 18, we know that everyone who has been born of God does not keep on sinning, but he who was born of God protects him, and the evil one does not touch him. That same letter does specify that the qualifications for being born of God means believing that Jesus is the Christ and loving the Father. So, dropped my Bible in a really dramatic way by mistake. So, no man is without sin. No man continually does good and never sins, except Christians. The only way around this contradiction is to no true Scotsman it. AKA, if any Christian ever does sin, they were never a true Christian in the first place. And then it would seem to make all the praying for forgiveness a bit redundant. The easiest way to check internal contradictions, especially if you're a beginner to this particular exercise, is to use the Gospels, because this is 4 different versions of the same story. Furthermore, people are most familiar with, and Christians most concerned with, the story of Jesus' life, and the stories about him, so let's focus in. It's Bible quiz time again. When was Jesus born? Well, it depends who you ask. Matthew, chapter 2, verse 1. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, aka Herod the Great, died in 4 BCE. Write that down. But according to Luke, chapter 2, verses 2 to 3, this is where he is talking about Caesar Augustus's census. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria, which would have been sometime from 6 BCE. The problem here is pretty clear, even if you are as bad at maths as I am. The described periods in Luke versus Matthew are at least 10 years apart. Most apologetic scholars simply believe that Luke made an error, though there are plenty of reasons to believe that both Luke and Matthew are ahistorical tellings of the birth of Jesus. Again, that's for you to decide. Regardless, these are 2 incompatible stories because they place Jesus' birth at different times in history. Any apologetic attempt to deny this is folly. There's a reason that apologetic scholars think that Luke just made an error. The best you might hear is that the Herod referred to in Matthew is actually Herod's son, Herod. But Quirinius wasn't appointed until after that Herod's exile anyway, so no dice. Now this is a great time and place to do your own side-by-side comparison if you are so inclined. Only Matthew and Luke tell the story of the Nativity, and the content in both varies wildly. I'll pause here for a moment so you can sharpen those doubtlessly blunt pencils. I will now do a very quick rundown for you. I don't know why I curtsied, it just felt right. In the Gospel of Luke, an angel appears to Mary. In the Gospel of Matthew, an angel appears to Joseph. As mentioned, Luke contains the census of Quirinius. Fucking Quirinius. Get a better name! As we just established, Luke contains the census of Quirinius. Then Mary and Joseph travel to Bethlehem from Nazareth. Matthew doesn't mention this census and Jesus is just born in Bethlehem. There he is. In Luke, we then have the adoration of the shepherds in Bethlehem. In Matthew, we have no shepherds and instead 3 magi, although actually it doesn't specify the number of magi. We just assume there are 3 magi because they leave 3 gifts. Kind of an interesting side fact on the assumptions we make about these stories without actually reading them properly. You may know them as wise men or 3 kings. We 3 kings of Orient are, 1 in a taxi, 1 in a car. the Magi go to see Herod in Jerusalem, loud-mouthing that they want to see the baby who's going to be the king of the Jews, which makes Herod very nervous. Then in Matthew, we have the adoration of the Magi in Bethlehem. Joseph, Mary, and baby Jesus flee to Egypt to escape the persecution of Herod, who then proceeds to massacre the innocents, as it is known. The story in which he orders the execution of every male child under 2 years old in Bethlehem. Then Herod dies, and if it feels like I haven't mentioned Luke for a while, it's because none of this happens in Luke's telling of the story. The Gospel of Matthew is the only place in the Bible that mentions the massacre of the innocents, the fleeing to Egypt. I will only also briefly mention that there is no historical evidence for those things, because today we are talking about intertextual contradictions, not historical contradictions. But I think it's worth noting that alongside the fact that Luke's telling of the narrative doesn't include any of those events, which, if they really happened, it would seem pretty crazy to leave out. Just my 2 cents. In Matthew, Joseph and Mary return from Egypt and settle back into Nazareth. Back to Luke, where we left baby Jesus being adored by the shepherds. Jesus is presented at the temple in Jerusalem, and then the family returns home to Nazareth. Once again, the common way that these two differing accounts are reconciled is usually by combining them as much as possible. It simply doesn't make sense. Squeezing the whole narrative of Herod and the massacre of the innocents into a story that doesn't even allude to it, and claims to take place at a time where Herod wasn't even around, that's impossible. And once again, it taints our reading by enforcing these expectations onto the story, instead of actually reading and understanding the story that Luke is trying to tell. It does the book a disservice. Next up, the genealogy of Jesus. I will try and keep this as brief as I can. This is another of the best-known contradictions, but it kind of passes laypeople by, because it's kind of just lists of names and not that interesting. It's like being back in Genesis. Why? I'll try and keep this as simple and as brief as possible, I promise. Both Matthew and Luke list the generations. They both contain different numbers of generations. They both contain different names. Both genealogies attempt to connect Jesus with important figures in the Hebrew Bible. So immediately we can see the theological motives behind these chapters, right? Even the numbers of generations included in these chapters can have theological meanings. Matthew starts with Abraham and works forward to Jesus. Luke starts with Jesus and works back to Adam. Matthew's line includes 42 generations with some notable absences. Luke's includes 77. I'll spare you the exact specifics. Luke follows the Davidic line through Nathan, an otherwise little-known son who was mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. Matthew traces the royal Davidic line through Solomon, though notably leaves out several generations. The ancestors of David in Luke are in agreement with the Hebrew Bible. In Matthew, these are different and more complex, including several mothers and brothers. Please, Matthew, it's complicated enough! According to St. Augustine, 77, the number of generations in Luke's list, is a number that symbolises the forgiveness of all sins. Matthew's genealogy of 42 is split into 3 lists of 14, 14 being the numerical value of the name David, and also double 7, which is supposed to symbolise perfection. That might go some way to explaining the omissions from Matthew if he wanted to make 3 perfect lines of 14. For example, 3 consecutive kings of Judah are omitted: Ahaziah, Jehoash, and Amaziah. These kings supposedly come from the cursed line of Ahab and are seen as particularly wicked. Makes sense to drop their names from the list. It is speculated that that was done to create the second list of 14. I'm nearly done here, I promise. Another interesting note here, Luke and Matthew both provide a different father for Joseph. Luke gives his father as Heli, Matthew gives his father as Jacob. So, those are pretty different. What's going on? First, the apologist explanation. The early church held that both of these lists are true. Eusebius of Caesarea, probably, in his church history, argues that the divergence comes from whether the list is considering the father by birth or by law. This is probably the most common argument you will hear. In An Exact Exposition of the Orthodox Faith, John Damascene, maybe, argues that Heli of the tribe of Nathan died childless, and Jacob of the tribe of Solomon took his wife and raised up seed to his brother and begat Joseph. The common practice was that a man must marry his brother's childless widow. Yep, Joseph therefore would be the biological son of Jacob, of the line of Solomon, as in Matthew, but by law he would be the son of Heli of the line of Nathan, as written in Luke. Some apologists say that Luke is actually referring to Mary's genealogy. I think I've been pronouncing genealogy wrong this whole video. Could you pretend that I didn't do that? Thank you very much. The immediate problem here is that obviously these are expressly Joseph's genealogies. The argument goes that Joseph could have been seen as being adopted into Mary's family if her parents had no sons, but that one seems a little far-fetched to me. The general scholarly consensus is that both genealogies are theological constructs. Neither, in fact, is historical fact. That is, they were constructed to support the claim that Jesus was the Messiah. Not only are there significant contradictions between the two accounts, but it also wasn't common for family histories to be available outside of priestly families. It's up to you to decide what the most likely explanation is. I'm just here to tell you the facts. Let's move on before anyone falls asleep. No more genealogies, I'm done with them. Let's spice things up again by talking about Jesus' death and resurrection. This particular narrative is invaluable in this discussion, not just because it appears in 4 Gospels that we can compare and contrast, but because it is also the cornerstone of the Christian faith. As a result, this part of the Jesus story is subject to my particular pet peeve that I mentioned earlier, the combining of all 4 Gospels into one story. This is so common in church, in children's books, and it makes the story incomprehensible. It completely changes, even wipes out the narrative direction of each individual story, changing the character of Jesus in every story to become something inherently contradictory, because he behaves differently in each telling, because each author was trying to say something different about him. If you've been around my channel for a while, you might know that Mark is my favourite Gospel. I think it's the most interesting version of the story, and key to the narrative differences between the 4 Gospels is the ending of Mark. It ends with the women fleeing the tomb and saying nothing to anyone. It's pretty abrupt and leaves you wondering, how are we reading about it now? Later scribes added a little addendum to kind of fix it up and make it gel with the other Gospels, in which Jesus reappears to his disciples and tells them to preach the gospel. This isn't always included in the Bible, since it's largely accepted to be not original. If it does appear, it tends to have a little note that says this is likely added by later scribes. Some other fun differences. In each Gospel, a different selection of people first discovers the empty tomb. Matthew and Mark place 1 angel at the scene. Luke and John place 2. John says that Jesus refused to be held or touched. In Matthew, the women clasp Jesus' feet. And in Luke, the risen Jesus invites his followers to touch him to prove that he's not a ghost. Come on, bro. Touch me. See? Look at that. Real as shit, dude. That's not what he says. In Matthew, Jesus appears to the women on their way to tell the other disciples that the tomb is empty. In Mark, he doesn't appear at all. In Luke, Jesus appears to 2 followers on the road to Emmaus, and then to his disciples. In John, Jesus appears to Mary, and she thinks he's the gardener. There are other more subtle differences, and few of the contradictions in the resurrection story are particularly theologically important, except as an obvious counter to the literalist argument. The reason for these contradictions can be very simply boiled down to the fact that these are not eyewitness accounts. At least 4 decades would have passed between the event first occurring and being first written down. And since our earliest extant copies are from Greek authors even later still, we can't be certain we even have an exact copy of what those first authors said. I'd like to finish up with what I think is one of the most interesting discrepancies between the Gospels: the last words of Jesus. With the exception of Matthew and Mark, which say largely the same thing, that being almost certainly because Matthew was written after Mark and used it as a source. Those 2 aside, all 3 Gospels have very different last words for Jesus with very different character. As I say, Mark and Matthew are very similar, so I'm just going to read the death of Jesus from Mark. I didn't mark Mark. This is Mark chapter 15, verse 33 through 34. And when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani? I'm so sorry. Which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Isn't that some good shit? In Mark, Jesus appears to have a last moment of fear and panic, wondering if he has been forsaken at this crucial moment, before we are reassured by the tearing of the curtain, and indeed the assertion of the centurion saying, surely this was the Son of God. This isn't what we're about today, so I won't dive into the sort of cultural history of the different Gospels, but if you are interested to learn more, the reasoning for that is quite clear as a more relatable kind of expression of fear that is then comforted by, no, he wasn't forsaken by God. Which makes a lot of sense. It's a very different telling than in Luke and John. Luke chapter 23, verse 44, it was now about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour, while the sun's light failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in 2. Then Jesus, calling out with a loud voice, said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And having said this, he breathed his last. Also a pretty exciting bit of storytelling, but quite different, I'm sure you'll agree, to the character of Jesus at his last moment in Mark. Also in Luke, the curtain breaks first, and then Jesus dies with confidence in his Father. In John, Jesus is very subdued at the moment of his death. In this telling, Jesus knew that he was done here, and so did his bit to fulfill Psalm 69. Don't laugh at that, you immature little sneeze. Psalm 69, verse 20. Reproaches have broken my heart so that I am in despair. I looked for pity, but there was none, and for comforters, but I found none. They gave me poison for food, and for my thirst they gave me sour wine to drink. Just a bit of context for you for the Gospel according to John. Death of Jesus, chapter 19, verse 28. After this, Jesus, knowing that all was now finished, said, brackets, to fulfill scripture, I thirst. A jar full of sour wine stood there, so they put a spongeful of the sour wine on a hyssop branch and held it to his mouth. When Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, "It is finished," and he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. So, Matthew and Mark, my God, why have you forsaken me? Luke, Father, into your hands I command my spirit. John, I'm about to die, guys, give me some sour wine so I can fulfill that scripture. Okay, I'm done. It is finished. Try and reconcile the manner of Jesus in Mark and John into one narrative, into one character. I better have some wine to fulfill scripture. Now it is finished, versus, my God, why have you forsaken me? It just doesn't work in a single telling. That's because, as I will keep hammering in till I die, you can absolutely have faith in that tradition and still accept that these are different tellings. To try and combine these all into one book, it doesn't just have these literal, historically checkable facts like, when was Jesus born? Oh, it was during this reign. No, it was during this reign. These are different periods of history trying to reconcile that. Just try to reconcile the character of someone at a moment of a story. They're making different theological points about Jesus, and if you believe that what they're saying is divinely inspired, it is so important to understand what that theological point is. That was your primer, that was your starter kit on intertextual contradictions within the Bible. I hope you found that interesting. Do let me know what you thought down below. Please do have discussions on the topic. Please also keep them polite. Be a friendly little guy. Be a nice little friendly guy. We can all be interested in the topic for different reasons. Jesus probably wouldn't have wanted us to call each other bitches in the comments section. That's my guess. Do consider subscribing to this channel if you haven't already. I have some interesting conversations with various Bible scholars. If you like this channel and what I do here and you would like to support it, you can check out Ground News using the link down below. You can become a channel member. You get comment priority, some silly little emotes, and a cute little ducky next to your name. If you like video game stuff or you just like listening to my voice, consider checking out my gaming channel, Little Duck Gaming. It is a fun, silly time where I only get tilted some of the time when video games are annoying and hard. The best way to support this channel is via the Patreon, and with that I must give a big old thank you and a shout out to my giant chickens and colossal quackers over on Patreon. It doesn't feel right to goddamn Conlar in this video, so just con the two. He's a good egg. Thank you once again for watching. Most importantly, have yourselves a very lovely week, and I will see you really soon.